Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Pulse with BP. I'm your host, Billy Parvatam. Folks, I'm so excited today to be joined by Mr. David Shumate, the voice of the Duke Blue Devils since 2017. He's also a former broadcaster in the MAC and the SEC. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, appreciate you having me on.
Well, I want to start off with first, how have you been handling this pandemic? I mean, this is something that has impacted our lives both professionally and personally the last year. Unfortunately, it impacted Duke a couple weeks ago at the AC tournament. So how have you been handling this whole situation this last year?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely been a different season than what we've been used to, but it's great that we're playing. It's great being around the kids and being here at Duke. I'm somewhat fortunate because each college and university has approached things differently, but I'm kind of, or at least I was. Now the season's over with, I'm not. But for football, men's basketball, I was kind of in their quote unquote bubbles, whatever you want to call them, that the team was doing, being tested, traveling with them. It was obviously very strange not having fans pretty much anywhere you went, certainly not here on our campus due to the protocols that we put in place. But it's been a very different year. I mean, I think everyone's kind of gotten used to it to some extent, but I don't think anyone's like super excited to do it again. Hopefully by the time we get to the fall, we'll be back to some sense of normalcy when football gets going again. But it's been a very different year. It's kind of interesting for those that get to watch the games or listen to the games. It probably feels somewhat like normal, but if you look at what these student athletes have had to do outside of that, it's been very different. In some respects, practice and the games have kind of been their opportunity to spend time with other people because they've been living in hotels here at Duke. I think it's similar to a lot of other places as everyone's trying to stay as safe as possible, socially distanced. So it's been a very weird year is the only way I can describe it.
Let's go back to more happier times. When did you first know you wanted to become a sportscaster?
Oh, wow. Hitting the Wayback Machine. I kind of knew that growing up. So, I mean, you don't think, sports radio, play-by-play, that specifically when you're younger. I just knew I loved sports. I knew I wanted to get into it from a journalistic side of things and had a chance to experience that in high school and get into it in college at Appalachian State, doing some women's basketball radio games my last couple of years there. But taking advantage of the fact that, I went to a smaller school up in the mountains of North Carolina, but because of that, had some great opportunities to work with David Jackson, who did the games then on their football and men's basketball broadcast. And as I said, had a chance to move over and do some play-by-play. And I'm sure you'll get into it. Had a ton of experiences after that on a national level, working with, at the time it was ISP and eventually became IMG and now Learfield IMG College, the rights holder for a lot of these colleges and universities and got a great opportunity here at Duke as well. But knew that probably since, 10, 11, 12 years old. You watch the games. You like to be a part of it. You love sports. You want to compete, but also there's something intriguing about the journalistic side as well.
So how did this opportunity open up at Duke? I mean, you did a lot of games in the SEC and the MAC, but this opportunity opened up with Duke. And what was that like to step into the job, especially because you were replacing a legend and longtime voice Bob Harris?
Yeah, no, so my journey kind of was a little bit different. There's a company based out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina at the time, was ISP Sports that had what in the business are called multimedia rights, where they basically work with colleges and universities to take some of their marketing assets and try to work with partners. And they kind of take on the responsibility as well of producing a lot of broadcasts, TV shows, things like that around the programs. So I got on with them because the facility in Winston-Salem produced broadcasts for all across the country. It's up over 100 now, colleges, universities they work with. Got on with them as a part-time studio host, cut my teeth working with Steve Cotton and Marshall. I was their studio host for a while, worked with the folks at Vanderbilt for some time, working with Joe Fisher and that group and worked my way up to the point where my day job, so to speak, was I was overseeing the radio networks for the Southeastern Conference out of Winston-Salem. I kind of skipped over a 2-year stop in Auburn, but for the sake of brevity, move it along. And then eventually got to the point where I was overseeing the broadcast facility in Winston-Salem and managing that and all the day-to-day operations. And all along the way, getting opportunities to do play-by-play and call games and get a chance to visit just about every island in the Caribbean, because when there's overlap between football and basketball season, you kind of fill in for some of the guys that have football responsibilities. And that's kind of how I got to meet the Duke people. Was Bob had some obligations to call football. I got a chance to work with John Roth to call a couple of basketball games that he had to miss. Got to meet some guys around the program. Obviously got a chance to work with Coach K a little bit, get to know him, and just really love the people I was working with and Everyone knew Bob was going to retire because he announced it a year in advance, and kind of knew that was an opportunity that was very interesting to me. I love what I was doing. You mentioned some of the national opportunities I had with the SEC and the MAC to call games for them, but Duke was a great fit, and had some conversations with them. Got lucky in the process. Somehow they landed on me, but it's a great opportunity, and Bob is such a legend here. Anytime you do something for 4 decades plus, it's your gig. There is no replacing Bob. So in some respects, it's challenging. In other respects, it's easy because you can't even try to. He'll always be the voice of this program with what he's done. Obviously, calling basically the entirety of Mike Krzyzewski's tenure, the 5 national championships. So it's great to get to be someone who can follow in his footsteps, so to speak. There's no replacing him, but it's an awesome place to be and an awesome place to work.
And you mentioned Coach K. You get to work with one of the greatest, if not the greatest, college basketball coach of all time. And for those who don't know him, that only see him through the national media perspective, what is it like to work with Coach K in more personal settings?
Yeah, to me and you mentioned Coach K. I would put Coach Cutcliffe in the same respect, or Kevin White, who's retiring now, or all of our coaches here on campus. This may sound a little bit Pollyannish, but the games are great, and it's fun to call the games and all that part of it. And don't get me wrong, that's a huge highlight of the job. But getting to know these guys on campus is a big piece of it for me, and getting to know the players and the coaches, and seeing them at practice, learn about their backstories and how they got into this. And as you just said, get some time with Coach K, where he has a sense of humor. It's dry. He'll poke fun at me, but to hear his thoughts and get a chance to talk with him and spend time with him about the issues around college basketball, about the issues around sports. He's a huge football fan, whether that be his Bears or our Duke football program. He's always asking me about football and stuff like that. So you get to see him. Obviously, there's a reverence for him and what he's done for the game, but to see him as he's never just a guy. That's not a great way to put it, but just someone you can talk to at practice or get his opinion on what's going on. And he's a guy that, and maybe this doesn't get as seen as much outside of the program, one of the more generous guys I've ever been around in terms of how he cares about people, what he does for people. He's established a foundation here in Durham, the Emily Krzyzewski Center, that helps students, underserved communities that need a pathway to college. And he's largely funded that himself, but create the foundation, named it for his mother. That sort of stuff he does, taking care of people, I think maybe doesn't get talked about as much because he's so successful and what he's done as a coach, both here at Duke, with the Olympic teams as well. But just getting to know him and seeing that side of him is pretty cool.
Well, that's great to hear. And I wanted to ask you, what are some of your favorite memories so far behind the mic for the Duke Blue Devils? I mean, you've only been there about 4 years, but you've already got to call some great moments, including 2 Elite 8 runs in basketball. Anything stand out to you so far over these last 4 years?
No, I mean, there's so many things you can look at. I mean, obviously, the ACC championship, the tournament run that Duke had in 2019 was special. Really, that whole team being along for the ride that was the Zion Williamson show, RJ Barrett, Cam Reddish, and what those guys could do, and how they kind of captivated a nation was kind of cool to be a part of and to see up close. So that was special, being a part of Daniel Jones's last season here on the football side of things, and what he was able to do, now being a starting quarterback in the NFL, and to watch David Cutcliffe mold him into a guy that didn't have a Power 5 scholarship offer when he left high school, into a guy that can start in the NFL. That was kind of cool to watch up close as well. And along the way, there's been little individual trips that have been fun. Like my first year, Duke had a basketball tournament in Portland. They had a football game jammed in between at Wake Forest, and be able to fly back and forth to do that. Calling games at Clemson for football and then flying to Maui for the Invitational. Games at MSG are always special, particularly when our program goes there. So, I mean, there's a million different things that you can point at, but yeah, there's always something new and fun. And as coaches like to say, my favorite game is always the next one. So I'm looking forward to the football opener in Charlotte this fall.
I'm dreading to ask you this question, but I have to ask you about one game in particular. That 2019 Duke team in the Sweet 16 beat Virginia Tech on a last-second shot. I mean, not last second, but I still have it in my nightmares when Ahmed Hill missed that tip-in. What do you remember about that game? I mean, a lot of pressure on Duke to perform in that tournament, especially that game, especially because they were coming off a close win against UCF.
Yeah, no, I mean, and the Hokies were getting back one of their best players that they hadn't had and didn't have in the first meeting, if memory serves. And I think there was certainly a belief that Virginia Tech could beat Duke because they just done that a few weeks earlier, and that it was going to be a very challenging game. It was in Washington, D.C. I remember Enter Sandman playing before the tip. So, like, a lot of people think about the entire arena being behind Duke. That one, Virginia Tech had a good chunk of the crowd in that. And little stuff like, that team, for as talented as they were, had just little crazy stuff popping up all the time. Cam Reddish couldn't play in that game, had a little bit of a knee issue, and the team found out pretty close to tip. So then you come out, and you won't like this part of the story, but to show how different guys pop up, Trey Jones, who had not been much of a three-point shooter to that point, hit a bunch of threes that night, and in some respects really saved Duke. Zion had a couple of crazy dunks, had some amazing recovery blocks, but that team was so interesting. At times they could be so dominant, but that tournament run, the week prior, UCF, Duke survived a tip-in at the buzzer, and the same thing as you said with Virginia Tech trying to tie it right there at the end and force it to overtime. It was an incredible game, and it was an incredible atmosphere, and obviously Duke was fortunate to get out of it with a win.
Well, I always maintained, Duke was probably the better team, and even if Ahmed Hill made that tip, it would have gone to overtime, so no guarantees what would have happened there, but obviously a great game, as you mentioned. I asked you about Coach K, but wanted to ask you about a few other guys you have a chance to cover or have covered. One of them is, you mentioned him earlier, David Cutcliffe. People talk about Coach K years ago. He was pretty legendary in his own right. He coached Peyton Manning, Eli Manning, won a offensive national championship as an offensive coordinator, rather, at Tennessee. What stands out to you about him in terms of your interactions?
Here's a guy who can see things that other people can't. And that's what stands out to me. When he came to Duke, I think it goes without saying, because Kevin White was a part of this as well, there was a track around the football field. And there really wasn't a 100-yard practice field. So for him to come here and not see what Duke was, but the vision of what Duke could be, both from a competition standpoint and from a facility standpoint, that's what makes him special. So many people, I think in this day and age, want to be cynical and look in the moment and think about what they don't have. He always thinks about what it can be. And I think that's something that you have to do when you're at Duke in terms of how this football program has built and how it can be successful. Alabama and those type programs, they're going to get every 5-star imaginable. So Duke is a developmental program. They're going to bring in guys that maybe were overlooked by some of the high-powered programs, but also guys that want to come here for the academic experience. Talking about it being one of their favorite slogans is that it's a 40-year commitment, not a 4-year commitment, because of what you can do here on an academic side of things, and guys that can come in and work. And, if you look from a competitive standpoint, that was certainly something that was a factor last year. Duke had a disappointing season, but no offseason really hurt certain programs more than others, I believe anyway. And Duke not having that all season, that time to develop these guys, I think this year you can already see it paying dividends in the spring. Obviously, there's going to be some new pieces at quarterback, some new pieces on the defensive side of the football, but you can see that work in the spring that's going to be so valuable. But that vision that he has, it feels like he's at his best when other people don't expect much. And to me, that's a very unique characteristic as a coach.
How about Danny Dimes, Daniel Jones? He seems to be doing pretty well so far with the Giants.
Yeah, no question. The thing about Daniel, he was not the most vociferous guy when he was here at Duke. He's a leader by example type, but the arm talent is breathtaking. And you see it with the Giants and some of the throws he can make and the things that he can do at that level, but here at Duke as well, his toughness. He took some shots. He still takes some shots in the NFL. And I know people like to poke at the turnovers a little bit, but it's hard when you're getting hit from the blind side. But he's a tough guy. He stands in there and he takes hits and he wants to compete and he stays with his team. I think back to, the last game he played at Duke was the Independence Bowl as Duke got a win over Temple. Well, he got hurt early in that game and Quentin Harris had to come in for a series. It would have been very easy for him to pack it in. A couple days later, he was going to declare for the NFL and say it's been a good career, but I'm not going to risk anything. But he came back and he torched Temple for the rest of the game. And I think that speaks a lot, one, to what his teammates meant to him at the time, but the kind of guy he is and how tough he is and how much he wants to compete and to win. And that maybe isn't what gets talked about him as much as maybe it should. A lot of conversation about how smart he is, how much film study he does, how he can throw the ball. But he's one of the better competitors I've ever seen.
What about probably the most electrifying athlete you've ever covered, Zion Williamson?
golfer or a basketball player. He's a guy that you find when he was at Duke over at the golf range quite a bit, working on his swing. But the thing about Zion was, as big and powerful and strong as he was, he had a smile who could light up a room. And you saw it more at the practice courts, at the K Center or in Cameron when they were getting going. Just a true team guy. Obviously, who was a youngster when he got here, but someone who loved the collegiate experience as much as he did playing and all the adulation that came with that. He's a guy who just loved being in college and loved being around Coach K. And it's widely reported that he thought long and hard about coming back for a second season, even though a lot of people thought that would just be absolutely crazy. You remember the dunks, I'll never forget the 360 against Clemson, some of the high flying stuff he did. But to me, some of the stuff that made him who he was what he did with his teammates. The fact that when he was getting interviewed post game, every time he made sure Mike Buckmeyer walk on was a part of it because he sat next to him with his locker. And we're on the team plane, we're on the bus traveling with the team. And this team that has so many current NBA players on it at the time, they were just a bunch of guys in the back hanging out, having fun, enjoying what they did. And kind of what we were talking about earlier, that's the stuff that I take away. I mean, obviously the athletic performances speak for themselves, but seeing these guys and how much they just enjoyed being a part of a team together was pretty cool.
And then what about, he was arguably one of the most polarizing athletes in college when he was at Duke, and that is Grayson Allen. I mean, a lot of opposing fans had different views of him, but you got to see him in more personal settings. What do you remember about Grayson?
Yeah, as you said, I started when it was Grayson's senior season was my first year. And, everyone likes to talk about Grayson, and he certainly had his moments that I'm sure he'd like to have back, and some moments where he wasn't his best self. But it doesn't get talked about as much, I don't think anyway. There's two sides to that coin, and this isn't in any way to excuse any of the behavior that shouldn't have happened. But what he took on the road and what he internalized and what people would chant literally for 2 hours of a basketball game. I don't know many people from any walks of life that could persevere through that and achieve like he did athletically, a guy that's always back on campus, a guy that's kind, a guy that's brilliant. Is he a competitor? Does that boil over sometimes? Sure. But I'd like to see a lot of people who criticize him take the heat that he did anytime he went anywhere. And some people will say, well, you earned it. Well, I was on the road with him for a year, and no one earns what was chanted at him. When Duke went on the road, that's part of the deal. When Duke goes on the road, Coach K's dealt with it for decades now. But he's a guy that has made some mistakes, but also a really nice guy and a kind guy. And as I said, a brilliant guy and a guy that his teammates would have at his back. They'd be the first ones to talk about what he means to the team. And I think that speaks volumes as well.
That's definitely a great perspective to provide. I was wondering, David, as the Duke broadcaster, how do you describe one of the best rivalries in all of sports, Duke and Carolina?
It's just different. And that's the best way that I can describe it because, the way the schedule is stacked, those games happen generally within a couple weeks of each other, and they're in the back half of the season for TV ratings. And more often than not, you're meeting a week later in the ACC tournament as well. But it's one of those games that, the phrase gets thrown around a lot, put the records to the side. It's more than that. Well, this is a game that embodies that. I mean, the level of competition, the way the two teams compete, no matter what your season has been or their season happens to be. Obviously, there's excellence that comes with it. A lot of times there's a 1 seed on the line or an ACC championship on the line. But it's just different when you're in the building. As Jay Billis likes to say, particularly for the games in Cameron, the air is a little heavier. It's a little hotter. There's a sense of anticipation. And I think, experiencing it this year, it's those games as much as anything where you really notice the crowd's not there because the fan bases are a huge part of what this is. And the game in Cameron wasn't even close to the same without the crazies. I mean, for an hour and a half before the game, they are rip-roaring ready to go. And that's a part of it, the build-up, the anticipation. And I feel for the guys this year that they didn't get to be a part of that. And hopefully next year we're back to what that is because that's as big a part of the rivalry as anything. But the games are just different, and you can see how guys ratchet up the competition in a way that maybe you can't see elsewhere until you get to the NCAA tournament. The level of desperation to win is the best way I can put it.
You have a chance to travel all across the ACC, call some great games at some great venues. What are some of your favorite places to call games in the ACC? And I was curious, as a Virginia Tech guy, where do Lane Stadium and Castle Coliseum rank in that equation?
Yeah, no, I mean, we'll talk football first. I mean, Lane Stadium is very unique. Obviously, the Blue Devils play in the Coastal Division, as does Virginia Tech, and we're back to divisions this fall. So I've seen those venues more so than anything. And in terms of a pregame buildup, there's nothing like Virginia Tech in a night game, and to see what that scene is like. Duke was fortunate to win their last trip to Lane Stadium a couple of years ago on a Friday night, but the place was rocking beforehand, and it's just different when you have that many people, and some of it is where you broadcast from, right? Like, we broadcast from the very top of the stadium, so you're kind of looking down on this cauldron and seeing everybody going crazy. And football has a very different feel from basketball, and some of that is because of where we're positioned, and it's so loud, and you're kind of looking down, and you can feel this energy building. So I would definitely put Virginia Tech right up there. I think, talking about what you were saying earlier with rivalries, Duke doesn't go to NC State every year, but, when Duke goes over to play North Carolina, that building is at a fever pitch from a football standpoint. There's different places that are just kind of cool to go. I mean, Heinz Field is a cool venue to see just from a pro football standpoint. Same thing with Miami. Clemson was neat to experience. Went there once, in the game atmosphere. I mean, each one's a little bit different, but it's hard to match the noise of Lane Stadium. You're right from that perspective. And then on a basketball side of things, Duke sees every building at their best, I think anyway, because of the attention that the Blue Devils draw when they go on the road. So you feel a different energy, and we've kind of already talked about the game over at the Smith Center with North Carolina, but Castle Coliseum can rock. And I don't know if it's because of how steep the seating is or how the students are there. But when that place gets jumping, and Duke has certainly had their struggles in that building over the last 5-10 years, it's a very, very difficult place to play. The Yum Center is challenging. Virginia is massive when they get going, and they get fired up for shot clock violations. It's just a different experience. But Castle's, they're on top of you. How vertical and how steep that is very different. I will say that this isn't an ACC question you asked me, but the coolest venue, the most intimidating thing I've ever experienced was at Indiana my first year at Assembly Hall, and kind of the way it's structured, it's just like a wall of noise coming at you whenever they get excited. So yeah, there's definitely a bunch of cool venues. MSG though, outside of Cameron, would be right there at the top of places that I've been.
David, I was curious, how do you prepare for a game? I mean, let's just say you've got a football game on Saturday. How are you preparing the week leading up to the game? And then how does that differ for basketball?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. I kind of look at it to say, from a pure prep standpoint, good rule of thumb for me anyway, is you're going to spend, probably 3 to 4 hours of prep for every hour that you're going to be on the air. And that doesn't include going to practice. That doesn't include meeting and talking with coaches and stuff like that. That's just looking over notes, building spotting boards for the broadcaster guys that are out there. Everyone knows what that's like. Putting down your basic information, keeping up on storylines, figuring out the beat writers for the other team, kind of seeing what's going on with them, keeping track of your own team. I like to watch film. I like to watch, on the football side of things, the last 2 games of the team that we're going to play. I like to watch our last game back to see what kind of tendencies we have. Basketball is fairly similar. It's a little bit quicker to do because it's less guys, and it's a little bit quicker to watch the games back. But there's a study side to it as well, visiting with assistant coaches, having both on and off the record conversations to get some thought processes on what the scouting report might be, what Duke's approach is going to be. So there's so many different ways that you have to go about it, because the way I look at it, you're prepping for the unknown. You're going in with as much information as you can, because you have an obligation, whether it's a thriller, whether it's a blowout, or what have you, to be able to put together a good, entertaining product, no matter which direction the game goes. And if you have a great game, I might not use half of the stuff that I prep for. But some games you need that. If things get out of hand from a good or a bad perspective, you want to go in a bunch of different directions. So each week is a little different. When we get to crossover season, it gets a little crazy, and maybe you don't have as much time as you would like to get ready. But it's a lot of fun, and you try to spend as much time as you can prepping and getting ready.
David, you've been so gracious with your time. I have two final questions for you. My first one is, what's your advice to aspiring sportscasters trying to make it, especially during this pandemic? I mean, you know better than anyone. It's already a tough business to break into, and now we have to deal with the realities of the pandemic. So what's your advice to young guys and girls like me who want to make it in the field of sportscasting?
Well, the first advice I would have is take advantage when you are in college of the resources that you have, both to network, but also I think people undervalue the equipment that you have access to when you're on a college campus to create demo materials, to have access to go to games and make tapes if you want to get into play-by-play and stuff like that. Because there is a stark line. Once you graduate, you become a professional and you want a job. Businesses look at you a little differently versus if you're a college student that wants to get experience. It's just the doors open a lot faster because in our business, it's incredibly competitive. And I've lived on both sides of this, someone who now does play-by-play, but also someone who was a hiring manager at one time. And you learn, I did over the course of 5-10 years, that when most people reach out looking for advice, what they really want is a job. You don't have as much time as you would like to sit down and talk with everybody about their career. And I can only speak for myself that I tried to make as much time as I could for guys that were in college and guys that were learning this craft, because I found that they really did want advice because they weren't in a position yet where they needed a job. And then the other thing that I would say is when you get out of college, have a sense of the direction you want to go. The industry is becoming so competitive and in some respects so hyper specialized that it's not enough, in my opinion, anyway, to get out and say, well, I want to call games. Okay, well, what does that mean? Do you want to call games on the radio? Do you want to call games on television? Do you want to work for a team? Do you want to work for a national outlet? Because those are very different paths and different experiences that you need and different demo materials that you're going to need to provide. And do you need an agent? Do you not need an agent? And unfortunate, it is what it is. There's so many people that want to do this. It's so specialized. It's kind of hard to maneuver amongst the different mediums until you're at a very top level and you're doing it. And then you have the context to try to do that. But when you're starting out, I would recommend folks, and this sounds simple, but it really matters. If you want to do television play-by-play, well, then you need to get some experience being on camera because that's what the hiring managers want to see. And if you want to do radio play-by-play, you need to have radio materials that you can turn over or audio-only materials that you can turn over. So that would be the kind of advice I would have. And then the other thing would be, I call the games at Duke. I got this job when I was 33 years old, 33, 34. I spent the first 10 years of my experience in this industry largely on the management and production side of it, working with collegiate radio networks, working with corporate partners, had chances to do play-by-play along the way. And I say that because, and this is my experience and everyone's experience is a little bit different. I love my job though. I got to work with some great people and it turned out that I got to reach my ultimate goal of doing play-by-play, but there was also a time where I just enjoyed what I did and I was comfortable with what I was doing. And I would recommend that to everybody as well, that when you take a job, make sure you're taking that job because you want that job, not because you think it could lead to something else. Because probably 2 or 3 months into it, if you take something you don't really like, one, you're not going to be very good at it, and two, you're going to hate it. And those two things tend to blend together. So when you're looking at opportunities, make sure you like that opportunity. I know everyone has long-term goals. I'm not saying you shouldn't have those, but don't think of something as a stepping stone because in my mind, that's not the best way to approach it.
David, my final question for you is, as you reflect on your career, are you pretty content with how it's played out? I mean, you're now the voice of the Duke Blue Devils after really working hard to get to this point. You've called the lead eights. I hope we'll have more opportunities for some big games down the road. As you reflect on your career, are you pretty content? Is there something that you would like to do in the future? And all in all, you're pretty content with how your career has played out. Happy to be at one of the best radio jobs in the country.
hard not to be content, right? I mean, I've got a pretty good gig working with Coach K and Coach Cut and all the different guys and students here on campus. No, for me, this is what I worked toward. This is what I wanted to do, and I like working with a team and telling their story. There's a homer call to that, and anyone who's heard me call a game knows there's a piece of that. But I like that side of it because you're invested in a team, you're invested in their success, and you get to know them a little better. So for me, this was what I've been working toward, and I feel very lucky that I have the opportunity to do it. But no, this is exactly what I was looking for, and I hope to be here. Maybe not as long as Bob Harris was, but if I make it that long, that'd be amazing. I'd love to be here that long.
David, this has been such a pleasure getting to talk to you about your career, your different insights and stories at Duke. Thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
No, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
That's David Shumate, the voice of the Duke Blue Devils. Nice to join us today for a conversation. This has been the latest edition of the Post with BP. Thanks so much to everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next time.